Hi guys, today I'm reviewing Story Killer by Kelly Thompson. Kelly Thompson, if you don't know, is an American indie author who debuted on Kickstarter with her book The Girl Who Would Be King, which is fantastic. I think it was one of the most successful books funded through Kickstarter. Young adult story about two girls with superpowers, one of them driven to good and one of them driven to evil, and in this book they collide and it's fantastic. When I heard Kelly Thompson was funding another book through Kickstarter, Story Killer, I was right on board. I funded it, I got the book and I got a bunch of the goodies and stuff, which were really cool as well. So today I'm going to speak about that. So one of the first things you might hear about Story Killer on the internet is that it has quite close ties with Buffy. One of the dedications in Story Killer is for Joss Whedon's exceptional Buffy, for without Buffy there would be no Tessa Battle, and so many other wonderful women, fictional or not, that I've come to love. In some ways, Story Killer is Kelly Thompson's love letter to Buffy, so I thought I'd speak a little about that before I move on to what I think are the main strengths and the main problems of the book. So when you break Buffy down into its genre, it's basically this kind of strange mix of horror and sitcom. In the settings in particular, this is really clear. You have the warm, comforting, safe library where everyone studies and their relationships and dramas and jokes. And then you have the cold underworld where all the seedy, demonic stuff takes place. And for the most part, Story Killer does this really well. The scene with Snow in the bath, for example, for me perfectly encapsulates that sort of dichotomy between comfort and danger. There is a supernatural problem happening and Tessa and Micah deal with it in very everyday, sort of mundane ways. And I love that, it's probably my favourite scene. So most characters in Story Killer have maybe a roundabout sort of Buffy counterpart, and you can sort of match up people with their counterparts. But this isn't a detriment at all to Story Killer. No one is a knockoff of anyone else, no one is super predictable because of maybe a relationship with a Buffy character. All in all, I'd say fans of Buffy, you're probably going to be fans of Story Killer. We can't really compare them at this point because we're looking at the first book in a series compared to 7 full seasons of development to develop that same sort of love and affection for those characters in the same amount of time, obviously, but I think given time, Story Killer could become something great. So the first and the smallest of the problems I have with the book is I have some issues with Kelly Thompson's style in terms of, on a sentence level, her writing. There are places where her word choice and her language could be more specific. When Tessa first meets Micah and Brand, she says they're funny. She calls them a little comedy troupe, and you really shouldn't be telling us that someone's funny. You should be making us laugh at them. Kelly's writing is really dialogue and action based, and that's fine, you know, everyone has a different style. It does make me wonder if she's maybe a novelist at heart or if she is actually more comfortable writing comics as she's doing now for Gem, or maybe even screenwriting. I can absolutely see how that kind of thing might come actually more easily for her than prose writing. Another small style thing is that she uses Tessa's name a lot. When you're referring to a character, you can either use their name, you can use a pronoun like he, she, they, it, you can use an indefinite noun like the girl, the guy, the person. Ideally you want to use pronouns almost all the time, except in cases where the reader doesn't actually know who you're speaking about. You're going to need to use a proper name. Kelly seems to have a habit of using Tessa instead of she. It's one of those kind of things where as soon as you notice it, you can't stop noticing it and it becomes slightly annoying. The first strength I'm going to speak about is that it has a really solid story structure. All the beats are in the right places, there's a clear development, there's rising action, there's climax, there's falling action. There's nothing in there that isn't cohesive. There aren't strange tangents or things that you just don't know why they're there. There are, however, unanswered questions, but this is the start of a series and so we kind of expect those, and a lot of them work as teasers for the next books. The second problem I'm going to speak about is authenticity, an idea that maybe there isn't just as much Kelly in this as there is in The Girl Who Would Be King. It reads a slightly further from her experience. It doesn't actually hurt. None of the characters' failures really hurt me in a way that they do in The Girl Who Would Be King. I'd maybe even describe it as slightly hesitant. The further away from your own personal experience a story is, the easier it'll be to write from an emotional perspective, but the more you're going to lose in terms of impact, in terms of emotion, and what you're going to be able to connect with in your reader. I don't feel like the conflict has the same complexity and depth, maybe, as The Girl Who Would Be King. The second strength I'm going to speak about is that it's just got so much warmth and fun to it. There's never a place where it's hard work to read, there's never a place where you're slogging through to get to a good part. It's really devourable, it's really easy to read in a couple of days, which is sometimes exactly what you need. Not long after I got it, I actually turned to it when I was having a really rough time with life things. I decided that I was just going to make a day of it, sit in a coffee shop and read Storykiller all day, and it was exactly what I needed, and it was like a healing balm. And stories like that are really important, I think, and I think Buffy is that for a lot of people, so it's a really good sign that Storykiller acted in that way for me. So on to what I think is probably the biggest problem with the book, and I'm going to call that Tessa and the Superman problem. I feel like Tessa has a case of protagonist syndrome, in which the author is kind of afraid to give them real flaws or to define them as sharply as minor characters. Out of a fear that they'll be unlikable. There are times where it seems like Tessa's power comes a bit too easily for her, and where you kind of wish she would just be bad at something. As I say this though, I'm also wary of that kind of criticism because it's generally a criticism that gets levelled at female characters, that they're Mary Sue's, that they're too overpowered, they're too smart, they're too beautiful, they're too good at everything, but it's not often levelled at male characters. Whenever criticises Batman for being too competent at everything. I just found myself feeling at points that I didn't really know Tessa, and you don't get a lot of her backstory before she moves to Lore, which is the start of the book, and I feel like that's really important. You need to know what her life was like before then and what has changed to really care about why it's changed. Hints about her not having very many friends or very many good relationships, but it would be really good to have more of that establishing stuff in the beginning, and find out where exactly did she go to boarding school, what was it like there, before we move on to the main plot. And then we already have a stake in whether she makes friends and whether she feels like an outsider. The end of Tessa's arc is all about suggesting that there's this kind of darkness in her power and the things that she's going to be forced to do with it. And she is in a pretty bad place. Tessa's giving herself a really hard time about the things she had to do. I think most of us as readers feel like there's nothing else she could have done, and we're kind of sympathetic to what she had to do. All in all, I just wanted a bit more from Tessa. She kind of starts out a sassy badass and ends up a sassy badass who feels bad about it. I was looking for more development than that. I wanted more change. The last strength of the book that I'm going to speak about is two of the minor characters, Micah and Snow, who both have fantastic arcs, both really complex and interesting, and develop a lot over the course of the book. Micah, for instance, starts off as this shy, sort of withdrawn character, and through her relationship with the fantasy elements and through her relationship with Jeff, becomes this really cool, badass, interesting person. Snow starts off as this really standoffish, reluctant helper, and we're very suspicious of her motives and her sort of villain status. She really develops, she gets really complex, she starts showing some strength that maybe even borders on heroic, and her relationship with Tessa really develops into one of sort of mutual respect. So Storykiller is first in a series, and as such there are quite a lot of questions and threads that are unanswered at the moment, which will hopefully be tied up in future installments. There's an epilogue which functions in a similar way to the Marvel credit scenes, which sort of pans out and sets up this bigger, badder villain and this bigger, badder plan. But fortunately, a lot of the teasers and questions that Storykiller leaves unanswered are really interesting, and I'm definitely there for the sequel to find out what happens next, especially what happens to Micah and Snow. So to round up, I do have quite a few problems with Storykiller, but at the end of the day I'm still 100% there for the sequel. I really want to know what happens next with Micah and Snow in particular. I'm really there for that. Even though I feel Tessa is slightly lacking as a main character, I still root for her enough that I want her to develop. I'm not like, let's just chuck her out the window and fuck it. So I think that's really important. And also I think one of the greatest measures of a book is when you turn to it and when you actually want to read it. Anything that I get the itch to read when I am in a shit place, it gets my stamp of approval. That's it from me, guys. I'd love to hear what you think of Storykiller. Do you have any problems with Tessa? Do you think she develops enough? Did you like it as much as The Girl Who Would Be King? Don't forget to subscribe to my channel because I said so. Bye, I guess. Marvel post-credit scenes. Post-credit scenes. Oh my god. Subscribe.